Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the Halftime Talk feature interview series. I'm delighted today to be joined by Mr. Victor Gao, Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization. Mr. Gao, thank you so much for joining us today on what is a very critical period and window for China, of course, and the world. So thanks for joining us today on Halftime Talk.
Thank you very much for having me.
Great to have you. Let's start with the topic of the hour, of course, which is the whole tariff scenario, emanating in principle out of the US, of course, and then watching the world respond and react. How disruptive do you think this has been to a country like China, which is a major importer and exporter, of course, of many things? How disruptive so far, and how do you see China managing these negotiations going forward?
Thank you very much for having me. What President Trump and his administration have launched is a global trade war, global tariff war, not only against China, but against almost all the other relevant countries in the world, even including an island where only penguins live. Now, this war is absolutely wrong war to launch. It is highly disruptive. It is basically throwing all the rules of the game out of the window, destroying open trade, free trade, etc. And I'm pretty sure this war will not achieve the declared goal of President Trump and his administration of moving manufacturing jobs back to the United States. Now, as far as China is concerned, China is doing the right thing to defend open trade, to defend the international order as it should be, rather than allowing any country to hold a gun at the head of the world and demand it to kowtow, to yield to its pressure, etc. On the other hand, China is also sizing up the economic losses that it will sustain in this massive trade war. After all, China and the United States are two of the largest trading nations in the world. Their bilateral trade at the height were about 800 billion US dollars, on the verge of going to about 1 trillion US dollars. Of course, in China-US trade, there is huge imbalance. US runs a huge trade deficit. China runs a huge trade surplus. But this is not what we want it to be. We want to have a more balanced trade. But the United States refuses to sell many things China has a big market for example, tech products, high-tech products, digital products of all kinds. So I don't think China is to be blamed. The United States is to be blamed for this imbalance. And both countries really need to work very hard to make sure that China-US trade become more balanced for mutual benefit. But this kind of maximum pressure doesn't get any mileage as far as China is concerned. China will continue to fight till the end to make sure that the US gets the point that they cannot just trample upon open trade, free trade, as they are doing right now, and they need to suffer the consequences. Now, coming back to the second point of your question, right now the US is levying 145% or so tariff against Chinese exports. China unprecedentedly has declared 125% tariff against all US export to the China market. The Chinese government has also philosophically declared that at this kind of tariff against US export, the American goods have no marketability in the China market, basically declaring that if you want to continue the trade war, there will be no trade between China and the United States, and China is ready to take on all the sufferings and explore all the other alternative markets in Europe, in Africa, Latin America, in Asia, and others. That means the Chinese government has made up its mind that it will not tolerate such kind of wanton acts of irresponsibility by Washington, and China will always emphasize the point that you cannot force me to buy your version of the truth, and I will fight back at any cost. And I think in this round, China is not only fighting for itself, China is fighting
Mm.
for free trade, for open market, for the international rules of the game. And the United States is the wrong party, whereas China is the right party right now.
So what you're saying really is that China is not going to blink first and has been responding in kind so far. Of course, we still have to see these things play out in the second quarter, probably more so. One interesting point, Mr. Gao, on that sort of balance of trade so far between the two countries, is that there has been obviously a big surplus for China with the US. Look, of course, it exports a lot of products to the US, and one result of that has been, of course, its accumulation of dollars and its purchase of US treasuries as a result. And of course, we saw some activity on that last week in terms of China releasing some of those holdings. How important do you think that is in this negotiation part of between China and the US going forward? The US debt issue and the fact that China has been holding so much of it because of its export strategy, obviously, initially.
Now, I would say the Trump tariff war against the rest of the world has already caused a disruption and high volatility for the stock market, the bond market, the currency market, and the job market eventually many other areas. And the American people will suffer the consequences. Now, as far as the US bond is concerned, I don't think the United States is in a sustainable position as far as this 36 trillion US dollar federal bond is concerned. Sooner or later, it's going to explode into one of
Mm.
the largest, if not the largest, financial crisis hitting mankind. When that will be, I do not know. Actually, part of the desperate acts that Trump administration is engaged in, for example, launching trade war, try to force other countries to buy the so-called Mar-a-Lago 100-year U.S. Bond, for example, is part of their desperate attempt to avoid this incoming imminent financial crisis. However, someone really need to advise President Trump that you cannot have the cake and eat it, because we know ever since the United States abandoned the gold standard and shifted to a paper dollar, without the backing of gold, the United States dollar, the US dollar, has been the dominant currency in the world up to
Mhm.
today.
Mhm.
And by logic, the United States is supposed to run a trade deficit, because you either have the trade deficit and the US dollar dominance, or you have
The
trade
opposite.
balance, for example, or trade surplus without US dollar being the dominant foreign currency. But if you want to have the two at the same time, have the cake and eat it, you run into this logical dilemma, I think. So I think either President Trump deliberately disregards this particular logic problem, or they have some other goals to pursue,
Yeah,
using the
absolutely.
trade deficit as the camouflage.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There's a lot of his policies and announcements, at least, defy a common logic so far. Mr. Gao, I want to touch on a point you mentioned earlier, which is, okay, well, if the US market in the future is going to be a no-go for Chinese exports, or much less so, you're going to be looking at new markets, as China is already. We saw President Xi touring the Southeast Asian nations only this week. Where do you see the future for sort of foreign direct investment and new markets for China? Realistically speaking, where would be the next ports of call to replace some of your external market, and
Well,
why? Mm.
Well, for the several years in the past, Southeast Asia or ASEAN as a whole has been the largest destination of Chinese FDI into foreign countries. And I think it will continue to be so. If we look at Indonesia, for example, a population up to about 300 billion people, very large in terms of the territory, and very close to China. I think China-Indonesian cooperation will really generate miracles, especially when Indonesia has the financial support from the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qataris, you name it. So we are talking about China engaging the largest Islamic country in the world, the largest Islamic
Mm.
population, with all the other Muslim countries, Arab countries, very eager to participate. Now, talking about China-African cooperation, Africa, in terms of the land mass, is about 3 times as big as China. In terms of the population, it's about equal, 1 billion, 1.4 billion or so. And Africa has huge upside going forward in the coming decades. So China definitely will be very much eager to explore further cooperation with the African countries, with the African continent as a whole, to generate miracles for both Africa as well as China. Now, Latin America, some of the American politicians declare that South America is the backyard of the United States. Now, let me emphasize one point. A Monroe Doctrine has died many, many decades ago. No one recognizes the Monroe Doctrine any more. And if any U.S. people, government or outside the government, still believe that Latin America is their backyard, wake up again to the megatrend. China-Latin American cooperation will be boosted in leaps and bounds in the coming decades, generating, again, huge miracles. Now, talking about China, and Europe, the noise is up is that they are in discussion about whether they should sign this comprehensive agreement of investment, even noises about whether time has been reached that China and Europe should really start talking about free trade agreement, for example. And once we have all these policy incentives lined up, I think there will be no limit for expanding cooperation between China and Europe as a whole and EU in particular.
Let's talk a bit about, Mr. Gao, domestically, though, the Chinese economy. And now we've talked, obviously, that's all impacting, all these trade negotiations and impacts will be impacting how China manages its economy. The stimulus measures that we've seen a lot of taking place the last year or two, as the GDP has slowed. We look here on this program very closely at the energy markets, and of course, and we track how much energy and oil China is importing, and that's obviously an indicator of how its economy is doing. But again, shifts within the domestic economic policy, more stimulus, more move to sort of more renewables, battery-operated cars, hybrids, etc. Where do you see the stimulus measures, given the economic situation? Where do you see those going this year? Are we going to see more aggressive domestic stimulus measures and a refocus from the government to its municipal areas?
First of all, I think China is still, generally speaking, going in the same direction of opening to the outside world and continued economic and political reform started back in 1978. And every day is different. Every day we face new challenges and also opportunities. Right now, the biggest bet in China is on what we call new qualitative productivity. It's a tongue twister, but what it means is that the future increase in productivity should be generated by technological breakthroughs, meaning China really wants to place a big bet on science and technology, new ways of doing things, creativity, entrepreneurship of all kinds. Basically, it's a reform in the fundamental sense. Now, in this whole context, I think China's push for AI leadership is absolutely very important. We believe AI revolution is already with us, and it will change everything we do as a human being, as a family, as a society, as an institution, as a government, as a culture, as a civilization, and as Homo sapien, as mankind as a whole. So the sooner you really jump onto the bandwagon, and the sooner you become a leading factor, for example, the better. This is the bet. I would say going forward, more and more increase in productivity in China will be from this new qualitative productivity focus. So I'm actually, generally speaking, very confident. Of course, we need to deal with some of the major problems. For example, population decline, fundamental change in graphics, aging population, you name it. We need to really deal with them hands-on, heads-on, without equivocation, without dragging our feet anymore. But generally speaking, I think comparing China with almost all the other major economies, I would say China is best positioned to deal with all the headwind unleashed by President Trump and Washington at this time. And we will be able to survive this round of onslaught of protectionism, distorted ego, and intimidation by holding a gun at every country's head, demanding its surrender, basically. Now, different countries face different circumstances. each country need to come up with its own way of how to deal with Washington's manhandling of itself. But for China, China need to rise up and fight back, and China need to put its house better in order, and then mobilize all the resources in the world and always be a champion of free trade. China now, literally, without any exaggeration, is the standard barrier of free trade and open market. This puts the United States under Trump in sharp contrast. And I would not be surprised if the world will be completely different after this storm comes to an end, after all the dust settles, compared with the world before this round of maximum trade protectionism.
Yes, certainly we wait and see what's going to happen. What about, I mean, we touched earlier a little bit, Mr. Gao, on oil imports. China, of course, importing from many countries, the Middle East, you mentioned a good partner there, but Iran obviously taking in most of Iranian oil that's on the water these days. And many people saying that, you know, in the negotiations with the US, if the US indeed wants to use that, as a sort of measure in its talks with China, that China might actually be willing to take in less Iranian oil if the US gives in a bit on its trade, I suppose, pressures on China. Do you see those two things being compromised together as a negotiating point, or is China going to continue to take whatever oil it wants, sanctioned oil or not, and you know, leave the trade negotiations as a separate issue?
You are raising a very important question. I double up as the chairman of China Energy Security Institute. So I personally have a particular interest in energy security for China and for many other countries. Now, talking about Iran, China and Iran are two sovereign countries. China is not bound by any country's sanctions against Iran without the blessing of the United Nations Security Council. Therefore, as far as China is concerned, China will continue to trade with Iran, and China will never yield to the pressure by any country by using its unilateral ways to push for extra judiciary reach of its policies against other countries, especially against China. So I will not be surprised if China-Iran oil trade will continue, even though they will run into headwinds by the United States. Now, China now consumes about 800 million tons of oil every year. It's probably one of the largest consumer of crude oil. Now, it is important to know that one of the leaders in Russia, in the midst of this trade war, declared that whatever oil shortage China may have in the future will be supplied to its fullest extent by Russia. So hopefully, Russia means what it says, and China-Russian oil cooperation will continue. We have pipelines. We can ship it by sea from the Sakhalin oil fields and other places in Russia. So that will be a very important supply. China, Central Asian cooperation with countries like Kazakhstan for crude oil, with Turkmenistan for natural gas, etc., is robust. We have well-established pipelines which can be doubled in capacity in the coming years or decades. Now, China also acquires a lot of oil and gas from Middle East, from Africa, Latin America, from Australia for gas, etc. So China's diversification of sources of oil and crude is one of our national policy. But allow me to make one point. Sometimes you heard warmongering in Washington saying that they want to cut off supply of crude oil to China. Now, assume the worst happens. Assume the world is on the verge of Armageddon, and China, given its 800 million tons of oil total consumption, for example, and that 800 million includes the domestic production of about 200 million tons every year, what will happen to China? Will China crumble? No. Why? Let me tell you. The Chinese domestic production of oil annually at about 200 million tons can be easily increased to, let's say, 300 million, if not even more, if it is necessary, if China is forced into the corner. Now, secondly, while the domestic production alone will not be sufficient to supply all the existing demand for crude oil, which is true, then China is rapidly pushing for the EV car revolution, and the
Hmm.
EV car in general most likely will help China to cut down demand for oil by minimum one third, if not even more, going forward at the peak. Now, the
Yeah,
other
many
thing,
many people are saying that it's reached peak gasoline demand, for example, already because of that.
I think so, because for oil, roughly about using a rule of thumb, half of the demand for oil is for transportation purposes, predominantly for ground transportation. You're talking about gasoline, diesel, etc.
Mm.
So the point I want to make is that even in terms of extreme situations in the middle of a war, the 200 million ton domestic production will be more than sufficient to supply all the military needs for crude oil. And if the domestic production can be further increased by 50% or by 100%, then it could more or less cover the bulk of the existing oil demand after the EV car has hopefully halved the oil demand for the ground transportation. So I think this is a very fluid situation. No one in Washington should really bet that if they cause the disruption in Strait of Malacca, China will crumble. No, China has well established plans, domestic production, overseas production, international cooperation with different parts of the world. So nobody should really take a bet that China can easily be wrestled to the ground by cutting off
Right.
its oil supply without suffering the consequences.
No, absolutely. And of course, the other source of energy that China continues to use is coal, isn't it? Because it's plentiful, it's cheaper, it's necessary, right? And in terms of China's position in the meetings such as COP, it's obviously taken a stand on that along with other countries. But of course, it also does have a pollution problem, doesn't it? It has quite a significant one because of coal usage, apart from anything else. Do you see that being tackled more seriously going forward? Of course, that means perhaps less coal usage. How does it plan to balance those two aims, if you like?
Absolutely. I think China now, after the withdrawal of the United States for this particular front, China is now the standard barrier of climate change revolutions, because all of us need to do the right thing to mitigate the impact of climate change. Now, for coal, China has the largest, if not one of the largest, coal reserves in the world.
Mm.
Traditionally, use of coal has accounted up to about 80%, more or less, in the total energy consumption. Now it has been down to around 50, if not even lower than 50%. It will continue to be reduced. And China has already announced many restrictions about the development of no new coal field, setting up of new coal-based power stations, you name it. So I think China is in the right direction. However, allow me to emphasize one point. In times of war, all these restrictions will be thrown out of the window. So if any country wants to put an oil embargo on China, well, while China will diversify and try
Yeah.
to solve all the problems, China will turn back to coal. And coal, once put to full use in China, will really significantly reduce the need for the use of crude oil. Now, there are pros and cons, of course, especially impact on climate change. But in time of war, we need to deal with the emergency first. And I think China will go back to full steam in the use of coal and try to reduce the use of crude oil, natural gas as much as possible, to focus on winning the war against whichever country which wants to dare to launch a war against China.
Mr. Gao, one more question for you before we let you go. Back to economics. GDP forecasts and realities for the Chinese economy. It was, hurtling along, booming at 8, 10% for many years. That has adjusted in the last couple of years. We're now at, a conservative 5%, still a very good growth rate. I'm not sure if that's being achieved this year, but what would you see the next sort of 5-year outlook for the Chinese economy for a realistic GDP growth targets, all things considered?
Well, for 2035, I think China most likely will achieve this 5% GDP growth, more or less, in that neighborhood. And you're right, for many decades, China achieved high GDP growth, way above 10%, sometimes 12%. But that was at a time when the total size of the Chinese GDP was much smaller than it is now.
Yes.
Now the Chinese GDP is much, much bigger. So the same, let's say, 1% growth on a much larger base, the GDP versus a much smaller GDP is very, very different. So I think a 5% GDP growth is quite a spectacular GDP growth for a size of the economy that China has right now. The second point is that even by the end of 2024, measured in purchasing power parity, the size of the Chinese GDP is already much larger than that of the United States. More or less, it's about 130%. The size of the US GDP. Now, some people say, well, if you look at the exchange rate, official exchange rate measure the GDP, Chinese GDP in terms of its size compared with the United States is coming down actually. But the real fact of the matter is that for the past 2 years or so, the renminbi against dollar has depreciated by about 17%. So if you factor in that, if you normalize that without this up and down US dollar versus GDP growth, then you will see the Chinese GDP compared with the size of the US GDP measured in official exchange rate still around 75%. That gives me hope that on the one hand, the Fed rate right now is a little bit lower than 5%, is not sustainable. Sooner or later, either President Trump or Mr. Powell will need to lower the Fed rate in the United States, and that will create conditions for the lowering of the value of the US dollar versus Chinese yuan. And I would not be surprised if by 2030 or so, the size of the Chinese economy measured in official exchange rate will be more or less on the par with the United States. Now, if you believe in Elon Musk, he keeps saying that eventually the size of the Chinese GDP will be about twice, if not even 3 times as big as the US economy. So I think while we need to read the tea leaves now about China versus US, PPP versus official exchange rate, etc., we need to look at the medium term. That is, in about 10 years from now, in about 25 years from now, and I'm pretty sure that the Chinese economy will be on a par with the US GDP by official exchange rate around 2030. It will be way larger than the US economy, still using official exchange rate, about doubling the size of the US economy around the middle of this century. So when Trump says they want to levy maximum tariff against China, and many people say, well, China, are you worried about losing the US market? I say, we don't care. Why? Because eventually, America should care about being locked out of the China market. And by then, the United States will vigorously knock on Chinese doors saying, let me in, let me in, let me play a role in the China market. China doesn't care. China cares about doing the right thing. That is free trade, open trade, free market, etc. This is why we are faced with this historical moment of truth. China becoming the standard barrier of free trade, and the United States wants to destroy free trade by launching the maximum trade war against the rest of the world. Let's buckle up and let's see what's happening as we speak.
Mr. Victor Gao, Vice President of the Center for China and the Globalization, thank you so much. It's been a delight to have you on Halftime Talk and get the China viewpoint on all these very pertinent global issues. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a great honor.